Hello, I'm Ellen Bintz, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois, in the U.S. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
Hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from close to Thirsk in Yorkshire, UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about, and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And as we record, it's May 29th, 2024.
This week, as the UN reports escalating violence targeting Myanmar's Muslim minority Rohingya community in the western state of Rakhine, and what it describes as a bleak milestone is passed, as the number of people displaced in the country because of conflict now exceeds more than 3 million, we turn our attention to the long-standing conflict and persecution of ethnic minorities that has been taking place in Myanmar. This has affected not only the Rohingya, whose plight has been well documented, but also other lesser-known minorities.
So where is Myanmar? I'm one of those people who always has to look it up to see where it is because my geography is not the best. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, is a large country situated in mainland Southeast Asia, bordered by China, Laos, Thailand, the Andaman Sea, Bangladesh, and India. Its diverse terrain includes mountain ranges, river valleys, and a long coastline. The pagan kingdom, founded in the 11th century CE, is considered the first unified state that marked the beginnings of a unified Burmese nation. A literate, prosperous kingdom had been established before the British conquest in 1886, when, after the Third Anglo-Burmese War, Burma was made a province of British India, marking the beginning of a colonial rule over the entire territory. It was only in 1948 that Burma officially gained independence from Britain.
Very interesting looking at the map. I hadn't appreciated it bordered India, way up in the north. And of course, there's a little bit of India that goes above Bangladesh. Well, I say a little bit in terms of Indian territory size, but it's a lot of territory, of course. So why has the country faced conflict in recent years? Hold on, fasten your seatbelts. This is quite a complex and lengthy situation. We've tried to boil it down to pull out the key points. The current civil war in Myanmar followed a military coup back in 2021 that overthrew what was a democratically elected government led by Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy, the NLD party. However, the conflict has long-standing roots, with military rule, civil war, poor governance, and widespread poverty spanning virtually the entire period since the country became independent. Independence brought together the Burma or Burman population from the Central Plains with many ethnic nationalities who were mainly living in the upland areas. But national armed forces known as the Sit Tat, also known as Tat Mador, have continued to sabotage both local and national administrative systems in order to remain in power. Constitutions established in 1947, 1974, and the current 2008 constitution, drafted by the military, have all favoured the Sit Tat and given them centralised power in government and over the judiciary system. Such power continues today under the control of the Military State Administration Council, or SAC, which directly controls the Defence, Home and Border Affairs ministries and dominates all government departments. The standoff between the military rulers and the people is not new. After a pro-democracy uprising in 1988, army generals effectively staged a military coup and systematically set about terrorizing the population, triggering the start of a civil war as a people's movement grew momentum to oppose the military. A quasi-civilian rule lasted between 2011 and 2020, while military rule continued in the background. President Thein Sein's USDP party first formed a government during this period, and, from 2015, Aung San Suu Kyi, leader of the NLD party, formed an administration that persuaded the people of Myanmar, as well as the international community, to support the Sit-Tat in regime change. Instead of focusing on national equality and the root causes of civil war, both the USDP and NLD administrations concentrated more on national reconciliation with the Burma majority, sanctioning prison releases and amnesties from crimes committed by the military. Both administrations failed to quash military influence. Notably, too, Kyi's NLD party is itself mainly comprised of Burma supporters. Non-Burma people seek either autonomy or a federal union in which all peoples can have equality and self-determination. To this end, under Kyi, talks with ethnic armed organizations, so-called EAOs, under the name of peace were held, which some viewed as being sham displays. In turn, the federal constitution wasn't reformed, as the Burma majority continued to wield influence. Kyi's government failed to bring about ethnic equality, and she herself was later accused of various charges by the military junta that has ruled since a coup in 2021, including charges of corruption and committing fraud in the 2020 general election, which the NLD is thought to have won in a landslide. Various human rights groups believe the junta's allegations are trumped-up charges concocted by them in an attempt to remove Kyi from politics and bring legitimacy to their coup. The 2021 military coup itself was staged by the Tatmadaw, the military, and immediately led to the detainment of Kyi, President Win Myint, and other NLD leaders. The coup was met with widespread protests and civil disobedience across the country, which became known as the Spring Revolution. The military's use of lethal force against peaceful protesters further fueled public anger and opposition to the junta. As the junta intensified its crackdown, many pro-democracy protesters took up arms, forming local people defense forces to counter its attacks. Some of these PDFs aligned themselves with the established ethnic armed organizations. The coup reignited long-standing tensions between the Burma Buddhist majority and various ethnic minority groups like the Rohingya Muslims, as the military were accused of committing brutal atrocities against civilians, particularly in states like Rakhine, Chin, and Kaya, causing millions to live in daily fear for their lives and millions more to flee their homes. Still, the junta has not been able to consolidate control over large areas of the country, and opposing forces are now gaining ground. Meanwhile, millions of people now face a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Oh my goodness, it's quite a history, isn't it?
It's a little confusing, and I can't keep track of who dislikes who. And
No. And yeah, it's not quite as black or white as is sometimes portrayed, particularly the way that Aung San Suu Kyi seemed to be trying to appease the Burmans and her own party, largely supported by them as well, whereas they're often cast, obviously, as being opponents since she is under arrest by them.
Yes.
So it's quite a confusing picture.
The bottom line is no one seems to get along with anyone.
No.
So what about the Rohingya? The Rohingya are a Muslim ethnic minority group who have lived for centuries in Myanmar. Despite this, they're not recognized as an official ethnic group and have been denied citizenship since 1982. And that makes them the world's largest stateless population while facing a genocide at the hands of the Tatmadaw. Being stateless denies the Rohingya basic rights, including freedom of movement and access to resources and essential services. All are vulnerable to exploitation, discrimination, and persecution. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has described them as, quote, one of, if not the most discriminated people in the world. Many have been forced to flee their homes. Violence in the country's Rakhine state in 2017 led to more than 742,000 people seeking refuge in Bangladesh, which I think is already pretty crowded.
Yes. Yes.
At this time, entire villages were burned to the ground. Thousands of families were killed or separated, and massive human rights violations were reported. Overall, more than 1 million Rohingya have fled the violence since the 1990s, although around 600,000 currently remain in Rakhine in western Myanmar, nearly a quarter of whom have been confined to makeshift camps since 2012.
Wow.
Whew.
My goodness. And increasingly, I think we reported previously that those who try to flee, often making very dangerous sea journeys, are being denied access to countries they land in. Bangladesh is virtually overrun. A number have tried seeking refuge in Indonesia and Malaysia, which are Muslim majority countries as well, and they've not been particularly welcome there, as I think we reported. So those who are left behind have got tough decisions to make, really, about what they do.
They do.
If they're able to move.
And what a statement by Antonio Guterres, because there are a lot of discriminated people in this world, and to say that they're the most discriminated is very disheartening.
Yes. And the biggest stateless population as well. This is extraordinary. So we might focus our prayers and intentions that all Rohingya people who fear for their lives, especially those who are still in the country, to have wisdom to know how best to protect themselves and their families.
Yes.
Is it just the Rohingya who are being persecuted? They're not the only ethnic minority caught up in this conflict. Myanmar is home to numerous other ethnic minorities who have also been impacted by the military's offensives and the broader civil war. They include the Shan, a major ethnic group concentrated in Shan State, close to the borders with Thailand, Laos and China. The Kachin, a predominantly Christian ethnic minority based in northern Myanmar. The Karen, mainly concentrated in southeastern Myanmar near the Thai border. The Rakhine, a predominantly Buddhist ethnic group native to Rakhine State, which is where a lot of the Rohingya are based as well. And the Chin, a predominantly Christian ethnic minority concentrated in Chin State, which borders India and Bangladesh. The ruling junta's attacks and human rights abuses have affected all of these minorities. Most have been engaged in an armed conflict with the Tatmadaw since 2011 or longer. Among many resistance movements, armed groups they have formed include the Arakan Army, a Buddhist Rakhine armed group, the Chin National Front, and the Kachin Independence Army. Some of these have united, and ground is being taken back from the National Army, while the junta has sought to bolster its own troops through mandatory conscription. Again, that's something we reported on a number of months back. So where might we focus our intentions here? We might will for international attention to be drawn to the needs of all ethnic minorities in the country, as well as to support those nations, and especially Bangladesh, that are carrying the burden of providing sanctuary for many of the Rohingya who have fled the country.
So what is the situation now? This week, the UN reported that the Rohingya community are facing attacks and displacement as fighting between the powerful ethnic army, the Arakan Army, and the country's ruling junta escalates in the western state of Rakhine. Tens of thousands of Rohingya are estimated to have fled for safety towards neighboring Bangladesh since the middle of this month alone, which is reluctant to accept more refugees, and many of those remaining in Rakhine are in dire need of humanitarian aid. The Arakan Army, AA, claimed control of the town Buthet Duang earlier this month, during which this anti-junta army was accused of singling out Rohingya community members for abuse, although this is being denied by them. The AA is now moving on the border town of Mong Dao, also home to a large Rohingya population, which the Myanmar junta is currently holding. Meanwhile, the UN said earlier this month that the number of people forced to leave their homes as a result of the conflict had surged by 50% in the last 6 months as fighting escalated between the military and ethnic armed groups. Myanmar has this week marked a bleak milestone with more than 3 million civilians now displaced nationwide amid intensifying conflict, said the Office of the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Myanmar. Myanmar stands at the precipice in 2024 with a deepening humanitarian crisis that has spiraled. Today, 18.6 million people, roughly a third of the total population, need humanitarian assistance. Before the military takeover in 2021, this figure was only 1 million. The ruling junta continues to heavily restrict the delivery of humanitarian aid within the country, frustrating the ability of humanitarian organizations to supply aid. So we might intend that these aid trucks and the delivery of this aid can happen, and there's wisdom in how they can make this happen.
Absolutely.
And the junta leadership will be moved by these international calls for compassion to allow it. What a mess.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? The Arakan army seemingly being accused, which they're denying, of launching attacks against the Rohingya. So into, these groups, which, if they all were able to combine together against the national force, would be a very strong force.
Yes.
And clearly have their own differences as well, which again, as we said earlier, just brings home the complexity of this situation. So there we may hope that there will be wisdom for groups like the Arakan Army not to engage in conflict with other minorities. So what are the prospects for peace? Analysts fear that the prospects for peace in Myanmar in the near future appear to be very bleak. They point to the fact there is currently no bargaining space or common ground between the junta and the civilian National Unity Government for negotiations to take place. Both sides are seeking to defeat each other militarily and have different visions for the future. Any future elections are thought unlikely to be free and fair, and will likely exacerbate local and national drivers of conflict rather than resolve them. Commentators also note that there has been a lack of deep reflection on understanding the underlying grievances that continue to fuel armed resistance against the central state, such as issues around natural resources, land rights, displacement, and environmental degradation, especially in those ethnic areas. Previous peace processes like the 2015 nationwide ceasefire agreement failed to address such core issues. While there are lessons to be learned from past failures, significant sacrifices and a revolutionary mobilization by the people of Myanmar themselves may be required to build an inclusive government and sustainable peace, given the current military junta's intransigence. Yet, underlying grievances remain strong, and violence between the ethnic minorities is a problem too. As one Myanmar essayist says, it's not about simply removing the military from political power and ending the Settat's stranglehold on the country once and for all, but establishing a new and more just society. International intervention has had limited effect. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, Japan, and regional bodies like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, not to mention the African Union that we featured last week, have sought to build mediation capacity and promote dialogue in Myanmar without success. China has also pressed for stability along its border with the country. The US has provided aid to the Rohingya and adopted sanctions against the junta, Myanmar banks, and oil and gas revenues. The United Nations passed a resolution on Myanmar in December 2022, calling for the end of violence, which has been ignored both by the Myanmar government and opposing forces. The UN Security Council has done little more than issue a few statements and hasn't to date taken any meaningful action, such as instituting a global arms embargo or imposing targeted sanctions on the junta's leadership. Former Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop was recently appointed as the new UN Special Envoy on Myanmar. She faces the daunting task of trying to facilitate dialogue and mediate between the military junta and the pro-democracy resistance forces. Nicola Williams, board member of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, believes that Bishop should not seek high-level negotiations, since there is no bargaining range for talks between the junta and resistance fighters. Rather, she recommends that she focuses on regional conflicts and ethnic relationships, such as looking at contests over territory and identities in the hotly contested Shan state, as we were just saying about the Arakan army and their potential conflict there with the Rohingya as well. Bishop's attention might also be well spent on behind-the-scenes work, according to Nicola Williams, that might improve Myanmar's humanitarian response system and building strong relations with China, ASEAN, and other actors that might exert coordinated international influence. Based on past policy, an approach that demands the junta pursue peace terms is thought unlikely to work. My goodness, she's got her work cut out.
Oh, wow. I think I would listen to Nicola Williams if I was Julie Bishop.
Yeah. Sound advice to me.
So where might we want to focus our prayers and intention? Since the fighting has intensified since October last year, when ethnic armed groups allied with anti-coup fighters launched a military offensive in northern Shan and western Rakhine states, taking over dozens of military outposts and gaining control of several key towns near the border of China. In recent weeks, the AA is now moving on the town of Mangdao, close to the border with Bangladesh, and home to a large Rohingya population, threatening this much persecuted group even further. Meanwhile, the UN said recently that the deepening conflict meant that close to 19 million people in Myanmar are now in need of humanitarian assistance, 1 million more than last year. And as UN Special Envoy on Myanmar, Julie Bishop, begins her term, we might bring our main focus for this week to the challenging role she faces in seeking a path to peace. And our intention could be, we will, that UN Special Envoy on Myanmar, Julie Bishop, and all international actors who may have influence over Myanmar's military junta leadership and warring ethnic groups will have wisdom to know how to pursue a path towards peace in that country. Please join us in holding this.
Absolutely. It seems wisdom here is the key, isn't it? Really having that insight, that special knowledge to know how to move this forward.
And a bigger picture, seeing the big picture.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. It's very complicated again by the global geopolitics. As far as I can tell, China, for example, is primarily only concerned in stability on its own border, having access. There's trade going on between China and Myanmar and between Myanmar and India, for example. It's actually tragically, like so many of these countries that face a lot of conflict, it's a resource-rich country. It's a country that has so much potential, but
everybody wants a peace.
Everybody wants a peace, and of course there are these very strong ethnic differences that have persisted.
Clive and I will be taking a 2-week break as I am moving and Clive is traveling. So we will see you back here again, or listen back here again in the middle of June. So stay tuned and watch for our next episode as we return.
Looking forward to that, and happy and safe moving, I would say. It's not something to be envied.
And happy and safe travels.
Thank you. Yes, it's going to be good to see some family after a long while.
So that about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in Clive's daily Insight Timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out, too, for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days, hopefully, or maybe not, in a couple weeks. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you. Go well. Stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Binns and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible or your favourite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.